Hello, Ramon, and welcome back to the show.
Hey, Lian, how's everything? Yeah.
Wow. Well, we'll get into that.
Yeah.
So for listeners, to give a bit of context to why we are having this conversation now, we'd actually intended to record a podcast on a completely different topic a couple of months ago. And when we got to have the kind of usual chat before we started recording, we're just kind of catching up on things. And it turned out we were going through quite similar experiences that actually felt like something that would be really helpful to share with our listeners. And but it felt just a little bit too raw at the time to share. So we decided to wait, do a bit more integration around it, and decided to come back now to have that conversation. And of course, as these things do, more has unfolded and happened in the meantime. So I'm sure there's going to be new things you're going to learn about what I've been going through and vice versa. So I'm really looking forward to having this conversation. Let's begin with, if you would just share a little bit of a snapshot of your journey with what we might say this archetypal calling to a particular function for a community, for a role that is kind of way beyond this modern culture and really beyond us as individuals, and your experiences with that.
Yeah. So I would definitely echo what you said, that the experiences that we were sharing when we got together to talk were remarkably similar, eerily so. And it definitely was another signpost for me that I was being asked to step into a particular function and role, especially at that particular time internally, to accept that I was here to do a particular type of work and to take on a particular responsibility. And I know in some ways we're discussing a type of work in the world that moves along the current of what people call shamanism these days, and or shamanic healing, or being a shamanic practitioner, or anything along those lines. And for me, that whole process started really young, because I was literally born into a shamanic tradition that came from the African continent to the Caribbean with the slave trade, and is currently one of the oldest known living traditions in the world, that is very, very deeply steeped in relationships with spiritual entities and in animism and magic. And so I
Just
was
to
literally
say,
born.
just briefly, for any listeners that would like to know more about, because we probably won't have time to go like really deep into that, but we did, I think, in our first episode together, which I'll link in the show notes. So I just wanted to give that quick aside. Do continue.
Sure. Yeah, of course. And the tradition is called the Lukumi tradition. Some people call it by other names, but that is the more appropriate name. And so I was raised in this tradition. That was my grandmother's work. She was devoted to that full time. And so I grew up learning how to do magic and engage with animism. At the time, I didn't really know it was animism. It was just what we did. And then I think that's something that we
I love
mentioned in
that,
the first.
actually. Just life.
Yeah, right. Just life. When I was about 17, though, as you know, it goes for many teenagers, I ended up rebelling against that tradition and going in my own direction. And at the time, what I found was various forms of meditation, Zen meditation, where I was just staring at a wall. Something that's called Osho's biodynamic meditations, or very cathartic, dynamic meditations, and as well as energy work from the Taoist tradition. And I was 17 years old and I was learning this stuff from books, and I didn't really understand what I was doing. And after about 6 or 7 months of practicing in this way, I ended up experiencing a very, very, very intense and disruptive and life altering experience, which people at the time, the best name that I could find for it was a Kundalini awakening, or Kundalini syndrome, even. In Chinese medicine, sometimes it's called, there were aspects of it anyway. They were called chi sickness or dragon sickness, for example, or meditation sickness. And later I have come to understand it more as a type of shamanic sickness, especially for me, because, this phenomenon showed up as immediate and massive disassociation. So my whole sense of the world around me was that it wasn't real, that I was crazy, and that it was all happening inside of my head, that I was hallucinating everything. And this lasted for literally about 6 months. It was a very difficult experience. The first 3 or 4 weeks were characterized by intense and perpetual crying that would last 4, 5, 6 hours a day. I would have massive, and I mean massive, spinal convulsions that would just literally almost epileptic is what it looked like and felt like. I would experience deep energy flows in nature that I didn't really understand at the time. And my emotions were going through a massive high and a massive low. And I was under a ton of stress at the same time. And it was a combination of those feelings and states that lasted for, at that intensity, for about 6 or 7 months. But the whole process itself, in terms of it being fully reconciled, lasted about 11 years. So my whole time at the wolf sanctuary, all of that, I was still dealing with a lot of these factors, not the intense disassociation, which thankfully resolved itself over time, which was an interesting process in resolving. I had to relearn the world, in a sense. But what did stay was the intense spinal convulsions and the intense energetic movement in my body, and this presence, which is, some people call Shakti, some might just call it the animating force. What makes animism even real is that it's being animated by this force. And some people call it Kundalini. But for me, because of my function and my role, I look back now throughout my whole life and I recognize that was shamanic sickness. And what a lot of shamans go through is similar to that. Not all of them, right? Some shamans experience something completely different. And then also later in life, I got very, very sick. And so I got sick to the point where I thought I was going to die. And so it took years to rebuild my health. And I'm still, in many senses, reconciling and rebuilding my health. So there was these two big initiatory events for me that followed one after the other, that have basically done what they're supposed to do, which is prepare me for a particular role and function. And that role and function is what we might call being a shamanic practitioner, or somebody who works along those lines. Yeah, a healer, someone who works with different spiritual forces and who acts as a mediator, and who also performs any number of different tasks in the context of their role and function. So that's my context, right? I hope that was succinct enough.
Oh, that was fabulous. And yeah, I so appreciate hearing your story again. Some parts new, some parts you told me before, but within that context that we're having the conversation in, I think is so helpful for people listening, because, and I'll share a bit about my own journey in a moment, but I remember the very first time I heard of the idea of shamanic sickness, and even though to a large extent it was after I'd kind of come out of the sickness, to have that contextualization and that meaning for the struggles, for the terrifying experiences I'd had, oh my goodness, it was just such a relief. I can remember, like, it wasn't just one moment, there was like multiple moments over the years that each time I've heard another kind of take on shamanic sickness, there's been this like deeper drop into knowing all of this was meant to be, all of it had purpose and meaning, and wasn't a kind of awful things just happening to me. They were all they needed to happen.
Yeah, I thank you for saying that. That was actually a factor for me recently when I accepted what this actually was. It was very reconciling in that way. Yeah, even 13 years later, it was
yes,
very it was very healing. Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it, how even when you feel you've reached a place of acceptance with something, there's potentially always more acceptance to be had. So it's really interesting sharing very specifically my experiences through this context, because I've mentioned bits of it, many times over the years, but probably not kind of like just in, again, with this one lens. So unlike you, I didn't have a kind of grow up within a tradition. However, I probably shared with you before, I had a very unusual childhood, very wild, living very free, close to the ground. And I look back and it kind of like wasn't like spoken about in an animistic way, but to a large extent it was. And so that was my upbringing. And then, as you're saying, we tend to kind of, as teenagers, rebel and reject that. And I kind of went headlong into the material world and did really everything I could to kind of like make life work in a way that would allow me to sort of function in that kind of normal world, the material world, the mainstream world. And then simultaneously, the kind of strange things that have been happening to me since probably my early teens, which included things like hallucinations, dissociative episodes, they were continuing. And then what became a kind of, I think, a real fork in my path. Now, a couple of decades ago, it's a longer story, which I'm not going to go into, but I was physically and sexually attacked. And and I thought I was going to die. It was, it was a very just, like an intense situation, obviously. And I was trying to protect my boyfriend, who I was with at the time, because he'd been knocked unconscious. And my last thought, I was kind of laying on top of him, trying to protect him from the blows of the men. And my last thought was, no help's coming. I'm going to die here. And then I was knocked unconscious as well. And so it was kind of like experiencing a death, in that I didn't die, obviously, but there was kind of, the experience was, I kind of like surrendered into this death experience. Interestingly, that itself didn't actually I didn't really see the importance of that until quite recently. It's often the case that people called to this path often have stories that involve death, near death, kind of like your story. You almost thought you were going to die, or you almost died because of your illness. And it was really because of the other struggles that came out of that experience. I actually didn't realize the importance of the nearly dying part until afterwards, to say, until very recently, actually. Anyway, after that happened, I then, for a 15-year period, had chronic facial pain, intense panic attacks, and just like, and this was added to these hallucinations and all these other things I was having. So it was a kind of very drawn out some shamanic sickness. It was intense in many ways, but not intense in the way that you're describing, where it's a kind of 6-month period. I mean, that the 6 months immediately after that happened, obviously intense, but not in the way that you're describing with your story. And then again, at that point, I was still doing what I could to kind of like keep the door closed to spirit and just continue on. And that was all just like blown apart upon the death of my father. It was like an immediate, spontaneous, like, I guess you could say, awakening. And shortly after that, all the symptoms I've spoken about in terms of the pain and the panic attack that were caused by the attack vanished. And yet the other things, the things that have been with me since childhood, like the hallucinations, were only growing more disruptive, because again, I had no context for it. I had no understanding why it was happening to me. And it got to the point maybe 7 years ago where I was waking up and having intense hallucinations about 3 times a week. And kind of like, they were so difficult for me to be with. I would often kind of like be screaming the house down, couldn't get to sleep afterwards. It really, it wasn't kind of like, oh, that's a nice hallucination. You know, it was really difficult for me to be with. And thankfully, because of the work I do, I knew a number of people who were shamans, and I spoke to a shaman that I'd interviewed on the podcast and asked her, you know, this is what's happening. It's funny that I asked her, because I actually had when I look back, I didn't connect to it with shamanism at all, interestingly enough. It just felt like, oh, a shaman's the right person to speak to, not thinking it meant anything about me, interestingly enough. I only just realized that now I'm telling the story. And she said, in short, spirit is trying to get your attention, and it will keep on trying to get your attention until you kind of willingly open to it. And her saying that, it wasn't like I really knew kind of like the how or what that looked like, but it changed something, because immediately after that, I kind of made almost like an agreement with spirit. Okay, I don't know what's going on. Be gentle with me, but I'm ready to sort of like start to open if you can show me something different to what I've just been experiencing. And I went immediately from that intensity of like just having these hallucinations, you know, so many times a week, it was getting difficult to be with, to like 1 or 2 a year.
Wow.
Immediately.
Wow. That's powerful.
Yeah. And so again, at that time, I still had I wasn't looking at this in like shamanic terms at all. It sounds strange, but I really didn't. I didn't have any understanding of what it meant. I just knew that this had worked, and it's kind of like, okay, I'm on a journey now.
Well, it's interesting because that type of understanding is wholly missing from modern Western civilization.
Isn't it? Yes.
Yeah, it's
oh
something that
it's so simple.
Yeah, it's something that we're having to rediscover and re-engineer and reacquaint ourselves with ultimately, because what's interesting to me is that, so thank you for sharing your story, really powerful. I also learned things about you that I did not know. So the interesting thing about this that I realized just super recently, right, which I see reflected for you, is that this is a process that happens to people. And it is a process that is in some ways completely out of our control, and that we do not plan, that we do not seek, that nature literally does to us. Nature and spirits, they put us through this process in some form or fashion. And that has been happening for eons and eons of time. And it's simply a part of some of the human experience, right? It's going to happen to some humans. And that regardless of what the modern world tries to do or takes away or removes from our innate nature, it can't really touch that. It hasn't so far. The best that it might have is suppressing it with intense psychiatric drugs. But outside of that context, there's very little that the modern world can do to stifle this ancient innate process that happens because of nature and spirits. And when I realized that just a couple of months ago, and where all of this was coming through, where I had an experience with an amazing woman who helped me really accept this role and function that we're talking about, which I can discuss more of later. It really, I mean, it brought me to tears. You know, it really brought me to tears when I saw both the deeper underlying intelligence behind these types of experiences and the beauty of this innate, inherent process that the modern world can't shut down. You know, it's so intimate and so beautiful in some ways, despite being incredibly difficult. Yeah, it was just really, really healing for me to recognize it as such when we understand that this is all happening and that it has happened to many people in one form or another. I think it takes a different shape for everybody. And that we're a part of that lineage, you know, some of us, right? Which is really cool, which is really cool.
I love how you've just said that. There is something so it's such a deep feeling. Every time I go to say a word, I'm like, no, it's something deeper than that. It's that, you know, the family of things that we're part of, that belonging of something so much greater. Is as you say, it's been there for more years than we can possibly even think of. It's this pattern is so perfect, so interwoven with all the other patterns that kind of make life work, so beyond us as individuals. And there is something so beautiful about tapping into the way that's just going to unfold, because it has always unfolded. It needs to unfold. And we can resist it, which I think is probably something useful for us to get into now. We can resist it for all kinds of reasons, but it again is beyond us. It's not about us kind of thinking, oh, that would be a nice job to do. It's not about our kind of thinking, oh, that would be a nice name to call myself. I know you and I are both very similar in that actually we've had great resistance to that. But I think it's really helpful to recognize, again, this is just so beyond us. It's really not about us.
Yeah, I appreciate that you said that. And I do sense that I think if a person, at least in the modern world, right, I'm not talking about an indigenous context, but modern world, I think if people are in a rush to try to find that title, that they maybe should take a break and really reflect on why. You know, for me personally, I agree. It was a very difficult process to finally accept that. And it's not really, and for me, it's not really about the title. It's more about the role and the function, right?
Yes.
I wouldn't also call myself a shaman at this stage. I've reflected a lot over what all of that meant. For me, I can accept the role and the function of contemporary shamanic practitioner. That to me feels more authentic. I may be performing the same role and function in the context, and I say that very clearly, in the context of the modern world, right? Doesn't mean that I could show up in an indigenous context and take on that role and function to the same degree that an indigenous shaman could, because I could not. It's just two completely different things. So for me, whatever this ancient process and this role has awoken in order to address very particular needs that are in alignment with my medicine in the modern world for the modern person. And which is why I can accept the role of shamanic practitioner. And for me, honestly, that's more internal than it is one that I necessarily need to put out there and tell everyone that I'm doing this. I mean, I wouldn't shy away from that, but that's really not the point. It's more about accepting it inside so that I can show up the way that I need to show up in my full power to do what I'm here to do. Yeah, that's been my reflection over the last 2 months.
Yeah, I love a couple of things about what you've just said. I think, firstly, looking at this from a kind of shadow perspective, I think with, well, this thing, but also anything, we can either be in a kind of deflated state about it, where we're actually kind of really holding ourselves back from something that's aligned, or we can be in an inflated state and kind of, you know, rushing towards it and telling everyone about it. And we tend to, you know, generally fall into one of those more of the time in relationship to most things. I certainly tend to be down more the deflated end, where I tend to do things much more slowly, kind of hold myself back, wait until I've kind of got, you know, masses of evidence before I step into it. But other people, you know, inhabit the other end. There's no one, neither one's better than the other. It's just, you know, that's how we roll as humans. But
I love those terms, by the way.
I think it's really helpful because it's so easy to think one is better or this is okay, because at least I'm not doing that over there. But just to recognize both, you know, are ways that we hold ourselves back from being kind of in alignment, really. And but I agree with you. I think regardless whether, you know, whichever end of that shadow pole we're at, there really is I guess attunement and responsibility needed to recognize, just as you're saying, this is so contextual. It's contextual to obviously us as individuals, like our unique medicine. It's contextual to our community, the community of people that we're here to serve. But of course, it's also very contextual to this modern world. And I love that. And I think, again, the more we can think about it, because so much of the work we do is about archetypes, I really love to see this much more through the archetypal lens. Like, is the archetype of the shaman, and in an indigenous setting, that person may be called a shaman, or of course, depending on the tradition. One of my friends is Sangoma. Fulfills a similar function, but they would be known as Sangoma, depending on the tradition, all these different words, or it could be medicine man or woman. But archetypally, it's a kind of someone inhabiting that archetype depending on the context. And I've been through a very similar journey with you as you, in terms of kind of like, I don't feel a need at all to kind of name myself something particular and kind of shout that from rooftops. And yet, because of my own pattern being quite like, you know, taking as many steps back from something usually as I can, I've been playing with using the kind of term shamanic healer, in that it was a distinction from the other work that I did that's mostly kind of forms of guiding and teaching, whereas this is very kind of intentionally about healing. And that was really a kind of almost like a call to me to recognize this is a very conscious function I'm stepping into that's different to other functions I have. But I think these kind of conversations about those words and about what the context is, and recognizing the kind of limitations of that, and also I'm sure, I think you and I have definitely spoken about this before, really giving not just lip service, but, you know, gratitude, but also being reciprocal about the indigenous people who are continuing these lineages, sharing their medicine, sharing their wisdom. All of these needs to be all of these things need to be part of this kind of conversation.
Totally, I absolutely agree. I wanted to add a small little tidbit, and then I want to respond more to what you're saying. That I think that as you know, we inhabit the archetype also inhabits us, right?
Oh yes, yeah.
And so then to respond more to this giving of respect to the indigenous lineages, that's something that has been a part of my resistance to accept the function and the role, and even in some senses, you know, calling myself a shamanic practitioner, is because so much of what flows around in those arenas and is related to those words has really degenerated the view of the power that is in those traditions. And there's no true respect given to it. People call themselves these days shamans with no authority to really do so, right? Like in terms of their experience through life, they don't really even understand the word. It just sounds like a fancy word, a marketing term, something that has become like a buzz term, and then people throw it around, and you lose the real depth of what that word actually is trying to point towards, right? And I love that you have done the internal work of finding the appropriate language that resonates most deeply with you, because language, while there's limitations to language, language is also fundamentally a type of spell weaving. And language is really powerful. And I think that if we don't take the time to be very, very conscious about the language that we're using when we describe what we do, that there's a piece of the transmission of our medicine that is missing, that is in the shadows, that is incoherent, right? Because the way we describe what we do is a part of the transmission in and of itself. It's a part of the medicine. So being really conscious about the words we're using in that way, I think, is really important. And I really appreciate that you took time to find it for you. I would call myself, and for me, shamanic practitioner made a lot of sense and makes the most internal sense for me, as opposed to shamanic healer, right? Or any other potential way that a shaman in the contemporary world might show up. But yeah, I honor that that's what showed up for you, and I appreciate that. Yeah.
And it's a work in progress as well. I just to note, we could have this conversation in a year's time and it could be something completely different. But again, I think with that attunement and responsibility, it will be shown to us, kind of whatever it is that is next for us, and that kind of like just being flexible about what that is, rather than this sort of rigidity of like it must be this, it can't be that, but allow that to unfold. Because what I've seen over the years personally, but also in the work that we do with other people, in that as we serve our medicine, it teaches us. It's in that serving of our medicine, intentional serving of our medicine, that in itself is an alchemy. That in itself teaches us, that in itself shows us. And so we have to start where we are, but recognize as we do so, we'll learn more about who we are and about our medicine.
I love that. That's a really good way to put it. Yeah, I never thought of it that way. Thank you for that. That it's an alchemy also. Because I'm a very conscious practitioner of certain forms of alchemy, and that was something that's also I've been experiencing, and what you just described, but that I hadn't really connected in that way. So thank you. And I wanted to touch on a word that you said, and that was responsibility, right? I mean, we're both talking about all of this as personal experiences and things that we've had to come to, and how it's been difficult in some ways. And I think it's because we both instinctually recognize it as a responsibility. That the people who are called to this type of role and this type of function, and or to just that are just orientated in this overall direction to do this work in the world, it's a responsibility, right? And the responsibility piece of it, the fact that you also mentioned that there's a context that has to do with serving a community, serving people, I think has to be primary, right? That has to be the primary thing, not what we get to call ourselves, not like the flashy ideas about what it's supposed to be, right? And that if we can anchor in that, if we can really anchor in that this is beyond us as individuals, then I think it puts us on the best track to actually be able to engage with this in a healthy way.
Yeah, very much. There's something so humbling and grounding when we recognize that's what it's about.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. Humbling and grounding, right? I think that makes sense because, as we were saying earlier, responsibility is a type of weight, right? It carries a weight. Yeah, it carries a weight with it, and a weight that we must carry. And so, and that's okay, right? It's I think that our world today shies away from responsibility on a variety of levels. We are like modern Western civilization, which is cool. I mean, there's this inherent valuing of freedom in Western civilization, individual freedom. And I think that that's great. And I think there's a lot of gifts that emerge out of that orientation. And at the same time, I think that it has to be balanced with the responsibility that we're also here to carry out in the world, right? I think in some older cultures, you find a lot more pressure on the responsibility piece of things. That's one of the reasons that I really appreciate the individual freedom aspect of Western civilization. But like anything, that is not balanced with its opposite, you get these polarized situations that leave us less whole fundamentally. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think this goes back again to what we're talking about. Like, this is a redreaming of an ancient function
Good language.
for these modern times. Like, that's so important to recognize. Like, this hasn't actually been done before. And to recognize that this modern culture is so disconnected, encourages kind of individualism, and that's part of the context we're doing this in. And we're obviously, most of us lacking true community as well. And yet the kind of paradox is this particular role only makes sense within a community. And so there is something just so, again, it's like it has to be a redream. It has to be like work for this paradox for these times.
Yeah, totally. And what's interesting about that is that it is happening in the context of having grown up in an individualist culture and talking to people who are in an individualist culture. And in some senses, you can't completely get away from that, right? Because in the context of a communal setting, you have a deep support system that's there for you, right? Whereas in today's world, if you don't at some level really focus on the individual process in order to be able to do any number of works that are required, your life probably won't turn out that great in terms of your lived experience, right? Like your lived day-to-day experience, because a lot more does depend on you as an individual than it would in a communal setting. And so that's a part of what the contemporary shamanic function is to help people integrate that into a broader sense of what it means to be human in the context of serving the whole. Right. Yes. So like that aspect of individuality is really interesting. I think a big part of the issue that you encounter with the intersection between the shamanic function and the superficial individualistic modern spiritual culture is that you cannot, as you said, relate to shamanism from an individualistic perspective, because shamanism is all about relationships. Yes. So it's one of those layers that gets lost today, and it's a part of what degenerates the function. But I do think that I'm actually really fascinated by the conversation of where individualism and collectivism intersect. That to me is completely fascinating, because I encounter a lot of people in the ancestral communities, in the indigenous communities, etc., who are really leaning more towards collectivism. And I understand that. That's more of an ancestral context, and that's fantastic. And I also, from my own experience, sense that there is a value in being able to also understand the individual. And in some ways, being able to settle on the individual can be profoundly useful. And so how do we bring those two together in a way that's harmonious? And I think that's especially relevant to anyone who's doing the type of healing work that we want to do. Yes. Because, as we're working one-on-one with people, it's so easy to, you notice it a lot where, you, let's say as an individual, have whatever issues you're feeling, right? Whatever's going on in your life that's disruptive, that's discordant, that you feel is an impetus to lead you to someone to help you. Then you show up, and then that person is living in the same individualistic paradigm, and they frame your whole process of helping you in this individualistic framework, right? But what if you come to that person and they're able to acknowledge both you as an individual and then frame your process as something that is meant to aid the whole, right? so it helps to recontextualize what you're going through as something that is a part of a broader story and not just about you. So that we can honor where you're at and also honor the fact that you're here to also give to the whole. And that's something that I find missing from a lot of like what we call coaching culture and things like that. It's just individual to individual. It's all about each other. The coach wants to get the money from the person that they're working with, and the person wants to just feel better for themselves. And it really, I think, narrows and cuts the whole process off from way more power, because power is not just found in the individual, but power is found in what you are connected to. So anyway, that's
no, I love the kind of, because we're kind of coming up on time, but I feel like this is such a important place to either leave it or leave it for now. So I'll just share what I have seen around this, because I think this is like exactly the right conversation. And maybe we have to come back and do a part 2 to this, because I think there's so much
I'd
here.
love
But
to.
what I've really seen over the years, doing the work that we do with people, which again, a lot of the people we are working with are the very people we're talking about here. The people who, I mean, let's for the moment put aside this word shaman. Again, this is about the function, it's the role, serving a community, working with spirit in some way or other, a healing, mediating capacity. And most of the people that come to work with us, they are those people. And so I love what you're saying here, because so much of the work we're doing with them is about their role in their community, them stepping into the healing work for themselves in order to then ultimately be able to serve the community. And the part that I think is more important now than perhaps ever is to, like you're saying, is this kind of recognizing we're in this culture that isn't grounded in community, true community. We are in a very sort of individualist culture, and it's really important that we, I guess, move into the gold of that, really into that individuation process, really recognize like who we really are at a soul level. Do that work of healing, do that work of deconditioning, rewilding, really kind of step so fully into the individual that it allows us then to have those relationships with other humans, our community, with the spirits, with the land, but from a place of truth, not from a place of, oh, I'm, because of this conditioning tells me I need to be this kind of person, and therefore I'm going to somehow have this, relationship where none of it's based on anything real. But to really come back to, okay, it all starts actually with who I truly am as an individual, and then make, not, I mean, then make relationships. All of this is unfolding at once, but have that as the North Star, have that as the orientation.
Yeah, I totally understand. Because there is this element that there's this quote that I really love, that I heard recently, that nature only makes originals.
I love that.
Yeah.
Who's
And,
that by? Who said that?
I heard it from a gentleman called Michael Meade, who is
yes.
Yeah, I really enjoy Michael Meade's work quite a bit. And we see that in nature. Every tree is unique, every rock is unique. And the context that I heard him discussing it in is that every soul is unique as well. And there's almost this idea in today's modern world that every soul is a blank slate, right? Or that they're all the same, as opposed to understanding that at a deep divine level, every single soul has a unique medicine and frequency to bring into the world. And that uniqueness is a part of the whole symphony of life. And a part of our work today is discovering that uniqueness, right? And as you said, right, really stepping into you as an individual so that we can bring that into the whole. I think where it gets lost again is when we don't recognize that our own individuation process happens in the context of the greater story arc of what we're here of life itself, right? Of everything. So
yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting because so much of the work we do at Wake the Wild is about myth. Our one-to-one crucible that's about to start is actually called Mythical. And,
Cool.
very much focusing on that kind of individual myth, the unique myth. But as you're saying, it's our own myth within the great myth. Like it always is both.
Totally. Yeah. And in my book, and in the new book I'm writing too, there's this section called, personal mythology, because it is a type of myth.
Yes.
Yeah. What is myth if not story? And what is our life if not story, right? And so, yeah.
Wow.
I love it.
So, moving gently towards a close, I guess there could be people listening that are kind of various places along their journey of the things we've been talking about. It could be people who are kind of in the throes of shamanic sickness, or perhaps, just coming out of it and recognizing the meaning it has, or perhaps like us, somewhere down the years after coming through the shamanic sickness, but still recognizing, wow, this gives more context, more meaning. What would you appreciate? Each of these people are going to perhaps be at a place where different things might be helpful, but I still feel there's something that you might want to share with them that is helpful for anyone that is called. And again, when I say called, I don't just mean a kind of, that sounds nice, like a deep soul calling where really there isn't any other choice. What would you say?
Yeah. So what came up for me to share is about how to orientate towards the challenges, towards the resistance that you're facing. And that those challenges and those resistances, in some ways, this is a crude metaphor, but in some ways you can think about it almost like weightlifting, in the sense that they're trying to shape you. And the shaping influence is about who you become as you navigate through or out of those challenges and those resistances. To go back to Michael Meade, there's this great book he has that he calls Fate and Destiny, or Destiny and Fate. I don't remember which one comes first. And he talks, and so fate, as I have come to understand it from a variety of teachers, actually, fate is what happens to you that is completely outside of your control. It is simply what you are fated to experience. And destiny emerges out of a conscious engagement with fate in order to find the golden thread, as it were, inside of that. And the way that we find that is how we navigate and who we become as we deal with the fate. And Michael Meade in his book says that another word for fate is trouble. And that what troubles us in some senses is what we're fated to experience. And so then as we relate to these challenges and these difficulties, the gift is in, again, how you are shaped by them, by who you become as you emerge out of them and resolve them and reconcile them. So that's something I would like to offer. And that there's a reason for the difficulty of the process, because when we look at an indigenous context, again, a lot of initiatory paths are fundamentally difficult. And even if they don't happen to you spontaneously, these cultures in and of themselves often have difficult processes built into different stages of life, because the difficulty cooks, in a sense, away that which has to be cooked away, and it takes you through a death process so that you can be reborn. And the difficulty and the challenges, as unpleasant as they may be, during the experiencing of them, have a purpose. And the sooner that we can accept that and start to develop the skills and the being that these challenges are calling us to do, the sooner we can move out of them.
I love that so much, that description of fate and destiny and how they interweave. I just love that. And I knew when I asked you that last question, I was like, he's going to drop some gold right now. I love that. I love that so much. I just want to add one final thing. It will be the final thing, I promise. What you were saying there about that, the kind of initiatory process of being cooked to fulfill this function, I think that's such an important thing to recognize, and again is part of what helps us to make meaning of shamanic sickness. And certainly in my own experience, it's like I had all those initiations, and then even at the point where I kind of got dragged kicking and screaming, like consciously, onto the shamanic path 3 years ago, that was a whole nother load of initiations. It was like a very, intentionally initiatory training. So it's like, yes, you're completely right. It's just like one initiation after another, but I can't personally see there is an alternative. It really is the way that we are prepared, stripped bare. And I think it's like there's a grace, I think, that comes with recognizing that's why it happens.
That's a good word for that. Yeah, I love that.
Well, this has been an even more delightful conversation than I was anticipating. So thank you once again, Ramon. I'm really glad we had this conversation. Where can listeners find out more about you and your wonderful work?
Yeah, my hub, so to speak, on the internet is theancestralnow.com, and everything that I'm doing can be found there pretty easily.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liana. It was a pleasure speaking with you. I love speaking with you, so thank you for having me.
Oh, really my pleasure. And until next time, goodbye.